In this chapter, communication, culture, and work, what we're going to do is we're going to expand on the previous chapter's idea of communication as a process by looking at a cultural context. Cultural context or culture has both national and international dimensions. Each workplace, whatever its national setting, has a unique organizational culture. Understanding the various dimensions of culture and co-cultures as well in a diverse society like ours can enhance your career success. Co-cultural differences include things like race, ethnicity, social class, generation, geographical region, and disabilities as well. What we'll cover in this chapter is we'll look at new information that reinforces the ideas previously introduced in Chapter 1. The cultural differences discussed here are easily associated with psychological noise that in any communication scenario can prevent effective encoding and decoding. Inherent in this discussion of cultural differences is the fact that the communication can be unintentional. Some behaviors that may mean nothing in one culture take on great meaning in another. Nonverbal factors such as eye contact, expectations of silence, maybe time adherence or dress code, and the nature of gifts provide examples of how one may unintentionally communicate. Cultural examples effectively demonstrate unintentional nonverbal affronts, as well as the importance of understanding various cultural norms. Finally, cultures of organizations vary tremendously, and organizational culture has a strong impact on communication as well as satisfaction at work. Finally, it's important to investigate an organization's culture before being hired. It's a good way of thinking about it. Just as communication is dynamic and ever-changing, so too are cultures, including those of our organizations. Since it's impossible to know everything about a particular culture, it is helpful, though, to minimally understand broad categories of differences in order to be a more astute observer of other cultures. It's important to understand high and low context cultures, for example, individualistic and collectivistic cultures, power distance, feminine and masculine cultures, differing attitudes towards uncertainty, as well as varying levels of comfort with conflict and disclosure, as well as different attitudes about time. This knowledge assists persons in business environments to monitor and adapt their behaviors more effectively in various cultural contexts. Students are challenged, you're challenged, to examine your own intercultural attitudes as well as your own competence and competencies, with a discussion of some of the ethical dilemmas encountered in multicultural, multi-organizational communication. By the time we finish up this lecture in this chapter, we will have a better understanding and the ability to examine our own intercultural attitudes as well as our assumptions, and we'll wrap it up with some guidelines for improving our competencies and skills. Nature of culture. Society is becoming increasingly diverse, making communicating across cultures and with people from many different cultures a business necessity. Now, when most people use the word culture, they think of people from different backgrounds or different national backgrounds. But it's important, however, to think about and realize that culture is something that is learned. It's not something that we're born with, or it's not something that's innate. Cultures are invisible instead to people who are used to and have experience inhabiting them. Before we get into cataloging the differences in communication around the world, it's really important to call out here that people from varied backgrounds also share many similarities. Even when we acknowledge cultural differences or variation, the fact remains that not everyone in a culture behaves the same way. Let me just put that out there. So let's look at a few of these. Formality. For example, Americans take pleasure in their informality and their quickness in getting on a first-name basis with other people. With the exception of a few countries, maybe, Texas, it's Thailand, and Australia, business exchanges with persons from other countries tend to be much more formal, especially at the beginning of a relationship. Social customs. Let's look at this next one. Cultural differences begin as soon as communicators encounter one another. Greetings may range from a bow in Japan to the Y, pressed with the palm to the head in Thailand, to maybe a handshake in Europe and in South America. In many cultures, gift giving is part of a business protocol. Knowing the details of a specific culture can be important. For example, India, cows are sacred, gifts of leather to be avoided. It seems pretty obvious once you think about it, but it's not something that we're going to know right off the bat. In China, avoiding giving white flowers or gifts in sets of 4 because the sound of that number is the same as the word of death. These are all great little nuggets that your textbook lays out, but I think they're really interesting to cover off on. Lavish gifts may put your host in an awkward position, so learning cultural specifics and choose carefully. Another variable is the degree of overlap between doing business as well as socializing, this last point here. While entertaining is a part of business, it's part of business in virtually all cultures. Socializing after business hours is a central part of building a working relationship in many parts of the world. Let's dig a little bit deeper in this idea of cultural differences in business. Let's look at style of dress. As travel and communication make the world feel like a smaller place, regional differences in clothing are becoming less pronounced. For men, the standard Western business suit is common in many urban settings, many large cities, many business settings. Time, or more importantly, how we approach time. In international business, the first shock for travelers from the U.S. may be the way members of other cultures understand and use time. North Americans, like most of Europe, have what anthropologists term as monochronic, or a monochronic view of time. Seeing time as almost a tangible substance, time is money. American speech reflects that attitude when people talk about saving time, making time, having time, wasting time, using time, taking time. In our culture, or U.S. culture, time is money, as I said, so it's rationed very carefully. People schedule appointments and rigidly adhere to them. I run my office and my work and my personal life as well by a calendar. I'm sure a lot of you do as well. Tasks are performed in a scheduled time, in a scheduled order, one at a time. The monochronic orientation, however, is not universal. Cultures with a polychronic orientation, or many interpretations of time, see it as more fluid. Meetings go on for as long as they take. They don't abruptly end because it's time. Most of the Latin American cultures, for example, as well as some Southern European and Middle Eastern cultures, have this polychronic orientation. In Mexico, for example, you make friends first and do business later. Next, let's look at this idea of tolerance for conflict. In some cultures, each person is responsible for helping maintain harmony as a group or society. In others, that's not as important. And finally, gender roles. Women from North America, Western Europe, Australia, the Pacifics, New Zealand, for example, travel internationally, are likely to be astonished or maybe put off a bit by the way they are regarded in some overseas cultures, where ideas of appropriate feminine behavior can be quite different than what they're used to here. A few more dimensions of cultural diversity. Let's look at this idea of high context and low context culture. So far, we've discussed the obvious differences between cultures. As important as customs and norms are, they are only the tip of the cultural iceberg. Underlying what might appear to be idiosyncrasies in behavior are a number of fundamental values that shape the way members of a culture think, feel, and act. In the following few discussion points we'll look at some of the fundamental differences. Once you learn about them and start to appreciate them, you'll understand how and why people from different backgrounds behave the way they do, and you will have ideas on how you can adapt to improve the quality of your communication with others. One idea is this idea of high context and low context. And Edward Hall, a famous anthropologist, identified two distinct ways in which members of various cultures deliver messages. A low context culture uses language primarily to express thoughts, feelings, and ideas as clearly and logically as possible. To low context communicators, the meaning of a statement is specifically as stated in the words that are spoken. By contrast, a high context culture relies heavily on subtle, often nonverbal cues to convey meaning, save face, and maintain social harmony. Communicators in these societies learn to discover meaning from the context in which a message is delivered. The speaker's nonverbal behaviors, for example, maybe the history of the relationship, and the general social rules that govern interaction between people are what really provide the meaning of the message. When delivering difficult or awkward messages, the high context speaker often conveys meaning through context rather than plainly stating the words to avoid upsetting their listeners or the other person. Consider a few differences between how a high context and a low context Chinese person might express the same idea. Now, after we've covered off on high context and low context, let's look at another one, this idea of individualism and collectivism. Members of individualistic, that's hard to say, Try it again. Members of individualistic cultures are inclined to put their own interests and those of their immediate family ahead of social concerns. Individualistic cultures offer their members a great deal of freedom in the belief that this freedom makes it possible for each person to achieve personal success. On the other hand, collectivistic cultures, however, have tight social frameworks in which members of a group, maybe an organization, feel primarily loyal toward one another and the group to which they belong. China, for example, like most East Asian cultures, that's an example of a very highly collectivistic culture. So these here are some of my favorite. I think they're really rich, and I think you'll see them quite a bit in your professional development, but power distance is one of them. Power distance refers to attitudes toward differences in authority. Cultures with high power distance, maybe Mexico and the Philippines, they just accept the fact that power is distributed unequally, and they're okay with it. Some members have greater resources and influence than others. In these cultures, differences in organizational status and rank are expected, they're routine, and they're clear-cut. Employees respect those in higher positions. Other cultures, such as the United States, downplay differences in power. Employees are more comfortable approaching or even challenging their superiors and may expect to gain greater power from that. Uncertainty avoidance is another one. The world is an uncertain place. We know this. In international politics, policies, trends, economic trends, and the forces of nature make it impossible to predict the future with much accuracy. But the question here is, what is the extent to which you are comfortable with uncertainty? Uncertainty avoidance is the measure of how accepting a culture is in this lack of predictability. Some cultures are very comfortable with this. They accept and are accepting of uncertainty, and it allows them to take risks, and they're relatively tolerant of behavior that differ from the norms. Other cultures are less comfortable with change, and they value tradition and formal rules and show much less tolerance for different ideas. Future orientations. Some cultures have a very long-term versus a short-term orientation, and they defer gratification in pursuit of these long-range goals. On the other side is the short-term orientation. These types of cultures look for quick payoffs. The willingness to work hard today for a future payoff is especially common in East Asian cultures, while Western individualized cultures are much more focused on short-term results. What about regional differences in language? Even in an age of great mobility, regional differences in communication style persist. For example, your manner of speaking can have a strong effect on how you're perceived. Maybe think about your accents or maybe your lack thereof. Speakers of standard dialect are rated higher than non-standard speakers in a variety of ways. Standard dialect, people are perceived as more competent and more confident, and the content of the message is rated more favorably. Now, it's an oversimplification to describe a single Hispanic, Asian, white, or black style of communication, just as it's dangerous to claim that all young people, women, or New Yorkers are alike. But each person's communication style is really a combination of individual and cultural traits. Keeping this in mind, as well as keeping in mind the risks of overgeneralization, researchers have found some patterns of communication that are common for many members of various races and ethnicities. For example, the amount of talk or silence that is appropriate can differ from one culture to another, as well as the attitudes toward conflict can also differ from one ethnic culture or co-culture to another. So as we start to wrap this up, let's dive into this last couple ideas of co-culture, dimensions of a diverse society. What are some of the ways we can break down and analyze our culture? And one of them is with generational differences as well. If it's not only language and regional differences or ethnicity, it might also be generational. So the era in which people have been raised can also shape the way in which they communicate. More than just a function of getting older over time, the historical pattern in which people can live can affect their values, their expectations, and as a result, their communication. 3 generations, this is very unique. 3 generations compose most of today's workforce and those present a lot of cross-cultural communication challenges. You have your baby boomers, your Gen Xers, and now your millennials. Yay!